Greetings Acolytes, and welcome back to the Ordo Grigio, where today I changed my mind about the Daemon Prince I want, so go from this to this. A Daemon Prince for my Blood Angel Plague Marines. I start with a grey prime, and then all the mutated flesh has been sprayed with Vallejo Russian Green through my airbrush. I begin with Death Guard Green from Citadel, thinned as always with a bit of water. I begin layering this over all the demonic flesh, focusing more on the areas where light would naturally fall onto the model. At this time I was fairly happy with the model, and thought it would make a great addition to the Blood Angels Plague Marine force I was assembling. However, it was fairly awkward to paint the model fully assembled, with all the wings and details overlapping. Next, I brought out Citadel's Xandri dust for the leathery flesh parts of the wings. The kit I chose to print had some alternative insectoid wings, which as I painted these wings, I wish I had printed instead. Whilst painting these wings, I hatched a plan. Printing this model had only cost me a couple of pounds compared to the 50 it would cost from Games Workshop, so I decided to find and print an alternative model, paint them both up, and see which I liked most at the end. However, once I had the second Daemon Prince printed, I haven't returned to this original model. Yet. So we're back to the grey prime with the demonic flesh in Russian green, but this time I'm being smarter, leaving the model in several sub-assemblies, so I can get into the nooks and crannies to get the model painted more easily. In a different direction, I begin with Army Painter's Pure Red, again thinned with water. I start blocking in the armour plating at this stage, and I don't have to be too careful with the paint, except around the fleshy areas, which already have a shadow colour in place. I think this model has better armour plating than the previous, and it feels more like it was once a Plague Marine who ascended to demonhood than the first model. Although that's just like my opinion, man. With the armour blocked in, he looks like this. Next up is Pink Horror from Citadel, for all those tongues and tentacles. This is where having the arm separated from the torso really came into play, as I could move it around to get into the details of the tentacles much better. Obviously it's intentionally focused poorly to save your sanity from the tentacles, and not because it's been a while and I'm out of practice. After a quick layer on the tongues, we're ready to move on to the next step, which is back to Death Guard Green. Second time in the video, first time for the model. Unsurprisingly, I'm using it for the same purpose as before, though more of as an overbrush than a layer this time, making the most of the extra detail in the model compared to the other. I was trying to keep the darker shade in there and be a bit more subtle with the highlights this time, but still have a good amount of contrast. It was a bit hard to determine the lighting at this point, as I still had not decided on the final pose, and in some places that were flatter, I switched back to layering the paint for a little cleaner lines, mixing and matching the two techniques as I moved around the model, and by the end of this step, he was looking fairly disgusting, but in a good way. To bump the contrast a little more, I used Ogryn Camo, again from Citadel, and I used this a bit more sparingly across the model in areas I really wanted to pop. Though it does look a little dramatic at the minute, it will be dulled with washes later on, which will help blend the colours together. With the flesh done for now, let's move on. I heavily thinned some Screamer Pink from Citadel so that it is transparent on the palette, and begin applying this around the demonic mouth torso. I'm not sure what the right word is to describe that body part, to be honest. I moved my brush towards the opening to deposit more pigment, and this should hopefully begin a transition between the green and the pink, and make the flesh look bruised and sore, where a belly button became a mouth. I circled the stomach sphincter until I am happy and move on to the arm. I apply the same technique to where the flesh of the arm meets the armour and metal of his power claw. I have a bit more space on the arm and can pull the colour back quite far to try and sell the transition. Leather brown is next for all the bone details on the model, which, being a Daemon Prince of Chaos, means bones, spikes, teeth, skulls, and toenails and a hoof. Magic. I start with the hoof as it's fairly flat and not very difficult. At this point I kinda forgot about the original Daemon Prince and was absorbed in the process of painting up this larger model. In my time off, I painted up a Great Unclean one, and found I rather enjoyed painting the larger models, which led me to this project. I debated painting some of the skulls in metallics as embellishments to the armour, but decided to stick with them being bone, as if his armour was decorated with trophies from fallen enemies. Pretty grim, I know, but he is a giant demonic space marine who worships the gods of sneezes and ear infections, so, you know. The hilt of his sword is also made from a spine, so that gets a coat of leather brown too, as a base for later. Speaking of metallics, it's time for lead belcher for all the armour trim and symbols, starting with the shoulder pad. The prominent symbol of Nurgle and the banding around the shoulder pad were clearly raised up, so very easy to catch with the brush. I had debated the claw being bone talons grafted to the claw, but instead stuck with the metal talons, as in my army this would be the ascended version of my current commander, who was equipped with lightning claws. So I wanted to keep this part as a nod to the original character, and to keep a more biomechanical feel. I then moved on to the trim on the armour and the joints. Now that there was a lot more painted parts on the model, I was also being very careful not to go on to the painted areas, and in hindsight I probably should have kept the stomach separate for painting, as it was a bit of nightmare to get in under all those tongues. Licky licky. Finally, his other arm was painted, including some studs, a skull I'd missed before, the talons, and then the blade of his corroded sword. Then Buckman's glow was brought out for the flayed flesh that hangs on his waist, a trophy of previous conquests, and not a convenient piece to hide a bad leg joint. Who would even think that? I wouldn't. I'd never accuse anyone of that. I also layered this onto the padding of the talon. I figured if it was the same tone as the human skin on the waist, it would give the impression that human flesh had been grafted into his weaponry and make him feel a little more sinister and demonic. I also dry brushed this onto the stomach to blend the transition where the green and purple meet and add a highlight to the darker colour. Xandri dust made a reappearance in the video as a layered highlight for all the bone areas, starting with the hoof. Whilst there was some texture to it, I added vertical lines of the highlight to further enhance the detail and give the appearance of deep grooves in the hoof, as well as catching the top 2/3 of the bony growths and the bulbous joint. The toenails got the same treatment, where it fit, and then it was time to move on to all the bone areas, such as skulls, spikes, horns and teeth. I really slowed the pace down here to focus on each individual part before moving on to the next, thinking about where the light would fall on each shape to make the highlights as feasible as possible, as well as leave plenty of that leather brown in the recesses for a strong shadow. Luckily I've practiced skulls a few times before, mostly playing Chaos, so picking out the areas to highlight to help them pop was pretty straightforward, though still time consuming. As I moved across the model, I felt something was missing in the base colours, and I realised what it was. The aptly named Demonic Yellow came out from the paint stand and was first used to block in all the eyes, including the one on the tentacle hand. Then I moved around every part of the model, hitting any buboes and barnacles with the yellow. I also hit up the windows in the vials on the chest and sword arm, and picked out the veiny Nurgle symbol on his leg. In my defence, when I came up with this plan, I did not realise just how many there was, and by the end of this stage, I was actually worried I'd made a Nurgle worshipping Mr. Blobby. I was hoping once it was finished it wouldn't look like it was about to go to Noel's house party. Next was Rakarth flesh from Citadel, which I thinned and painted a layer over the insect wings. These grant him the demonic flight ability, though realistically I'm not sure there's a world where these wings would support the sheer bulk of the Daemon Prince. But that's fine, we just wave our hands and say, Demons! And then it all makes sense, right? Once these wings were layered up, I used this colour for a final highlight on the skulls and bone parts on the Daemon Prince's foot, catching only the sharpest edges or where I want more emphasis on the model. Temple Guard Blue was used to add a bit of contrast to the model's face, painting this onto the pipes that run down either side of his mask. Originally it was supposed to be a tentacle coming from his mouth, but he looked like a duck suffering from anaphylactic shock, so mask it is. Army Painter's matte black was then used for all the remaining joints in the armour on the knees, hips, necks and arms. The kit I used for this model has ball and socket joints at every joint, so you can pose it how you want. though this leaves a lot of exposed joints, which I had to figure out what to do with. I decided black was the best option, as it would mirror the ribbing of the joints in the Plague Marines he would fight alongside, and help reinforce the image that he was once a Plague Marine too. I brought out the speed paint Malignant Green, as the wings looked a little flat and were not quite disgusting enough. I applied this heavily across the wings, which both brought out the details and made it a very disgusting green, suitable for a follower of Nurgle. I also applied a little to some of the areas of the flesh to add a bit of colour variance, though looking at the finished model in front of me, this is undetectable, so may not be the best use of time and paint. Now all the initial layers and highlights are done, Agrak's Earthshade is brought out and applied generously to the entire model, except the wings where we use the speed paint. I start with the shoulder pad and make sure I get into all the recesses and tint the armour. Normally I would use a couple of different washes and shades on models, such as black wash on silver metallics. However, brown wash over silver gives it a rusted and corroded feel, so the model got the wash everywhere. This helps tone down some of the colour differences and blend in the areas where I move from green flesh to purple, as well as add a contrast to the details of the model. Thankfully it toned down the yellow quite a bit, so it was more diseased than Mr. Blobby. While the wash dried, I got carried away and painted his base, so carried away in fact that I forgot to record any of it. It's similar steps to what I do on the model, but I paint the Marine as a 3rd edition Ultramarine that's being stood on by a Daemon Prince. I then fully assemble the model so I could move on to some final highlights. Once assembled and the glue dried, Bugman's Glow was thinned and applied to the ribbing of the pads on the Lightning Claw. Now it was in position, I could focus this highlight on the top 2/3 of each line to give it a more volumetric feel. The tattered skin cloth also got a few select highlights, though I left it mostly dark as it was beneath the wings and would be in shadow. Zandri dust next for selected bone highlights across the model, more focused than the previous stages and a bit more sparing. I actually went over the Rakhar flesh highlights on some of the bone here to reintroduce warmth to the areas, as the Rakhar flesh is fairly desaturated. Again, now the model is assembled, I can focus some of the highlights on the upper portions of the model, now that I know how they are orientated. Pink Horror came back out for the tongues, layering it on and leaving some of the previous paint as shadow. I also added some horizontal lines in areas to add texture to the tongue as well, trying only to catch areas that would be the brightest. I decided to leave the tentacles alone, as this would create some difference between the two uses of pink on the model. Finally, Temple Guard Blue was brought out to highlight the pipes on the Daemon Prince's mask, again focusing on the upper portions. I then decided that the yellow in the eyes made them seem more like growths rather than eyes, so I painted over this with the blue to give them a cold, icy look, which I think suits the model much better. This left me with this, which is much better than the initial model would have looked. However, it was still missing some shine, and after some tactical gloss varnish, he was done. I'd say he's not bad for around 2.5 hours of brush time, and certainly fits my Plague Marine force. Hopefully you've enjoyed this journey of indecisiveness and demonic influence. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.